The wind chewed through the bunkhouse walls like teeth on old timber. But the fire held its ground, crackling steady between the men who hadn't slept in 2 nights. Outside, cattle froze, standing up inside. The only thing keeping the cold from finishing its work was the way the Cowboys fed that flame. Before we ride further, tell us where you're listening from, and if Frontier Tales speak to you, hitch your horse at the channel and stay for tomorrow's story. The first sign wasn't the snow. It was the stillness. Before the freeze swept through the Texas Panhandle in the winter of 1886, the sky turned the color of cold iron and stayed that way. No wind, no birdsong, just a hard silence that made the cowhands go quiet too. Tom Halstead noticed it first, a Tennessee-born trail rider with frostbitten earlobes and the kind of instincts you didn't argue with. He stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse, staring at the horizon like he could already see death, rolling in on invisible hooves. "Feels wrong," he muttered, tugging the flap of his coat tighter. "Feels like it's gonna break hard." The bunkhouse sat 10 miles outside of Amarillo, a low wooden structure built fast and flat against the earth, more draft than wall in some corners. There were 7 of them holed up inside that winter, working the winter line for Double R Ranch, the kind of job you only took if you didn't have anywhere else to be. Men with debts, regrets, or names they didn't use anymore. Men who counted time by the weight of the woodpile and the sting of their coffee, not calendars. Inside, it smelled of wet wool, boiled beans, and the pine smoke curling from the fire pit in the middle of the floor. That pit was new, a square metal frame raised a foot off the floor, welded by the blacksmith in town and dragged by wagon across 3 miles of mud before the freeze set in. The Cowboys had scoffed at it at first. "Too fancy," one had said. "We ain't rail barons." But when the nights dropped to 20 below and the cold rattled their boot soles, they stopped complaining. No chimney, no hearth. Just the square box, set dead center on the bunkhouse floor with a ring of smooth stones around its legs to keep the sparks honest. They fed it cottonwood and elm from a stack near the bunks, cut and split by hand the week before the first snow fell. It threw heat in every direction, not enough to chase the cold out entirely, but enough to keep skin from cracking and breath from turning to glass. That first night, they burned more wood than they should have. Tried to pretend it was just another cold snap, but when the horses started refusing water and the wind came howling like it had teeth, they knew better. The freeze wasn't a visit, it was a siege. Tom stayed near the fire, always. Sat cross-legged on the floor, wrapped in a gray wool blanket that used to belong to his brother. He never said much, just watched the flames, kept them fed, and when asked how cold it might get, said only this: "Colder than what you got clothes for," and they believed him. By the second night, they could hear the cold breathing through the walls. It came in slow at first, a whisper through the cracks between the cedar planks, curling beneath the doorframe, creeping down from the loft like a living thing. The men stopped talking. Even the horses in the lean-to shelter outside went silent, their tails stiff, their bodies hunched like shadows against the wind. The fire pit glowed steady, but the heat didn't reach the corners anymore. It was like trying to warm a canyon with a match. They moved closer, pulled their bedrolls off the bunks, and laid them near the pit in a rough circle. Blankets layered on coats, gloves worn even while sleeping. No one undressed, not even to rest. Boots stayed on, fingers curled into fists. They slept with their faces half covered, breathing slow so the moisture in their lungs wouldn't freeze against their own skin. Halstead was the one who figured out the trick with the canvas. He had seen it once before, up north, during a brutal storm that hit Dodge City back in '79. He'd helped a scout build a canvas wind baffle, a square of tarp strung along the inside of a wall to block the draft and trap warm air between. Crude insulation. Ugly, but it worked. He pulled out his bedroll and cut it in half, then nailed the heavy canvas to the north wall, low and tight. "Traps the warmth," he said, "like a second skin." Soon, every man was doing the same. Coats too worn to wear became wall skins. Saddle blankets hung like curtains from bunk posts. Even a few old wool shirts got sacrificed to the cause. Anything to keep the cold from getting in. The fire became the center of everything. They rotated positions, like cattle around a watering hole, always someone tending, someone turning the logs, someone adding another split length of elm. The woodpile started to shrink faster than anyone liked. They didn't speak of it out loud, but every eye lingered longer on the stack each time they passed it. They counted it in silence. Outside, the freeze deepened. The mercury in the barn thermometer, a rusted piece of kit from St. Louis, had dropped below anything it had marked before. The leather on the saddle straps froze hard. Fence wire snapped with the sound of gunfire. A steer was found standing stiff near the creek, eyes glazed, tail frozen straight. "You'd think hell froze over," one man muttered. But even hell had fire. They were not so lucky if the wood ran out. Each night, they burned just enough to keep the air moving. They opened the fire pit slightly at dusk, then closed the lid at dawn to save heat in the embers. It was a dance, precise and cautious. Too much heat wasted fuel, too little, and frost came inside. The bunkhouse had become its own kind of body, breathing through cloth, sweating smoke, and dreaming in orange flame. On the morning of the fourth day, they woke to silence so complete it made the fire snap louder than a rifle. No wind, no frost ticking against the window panes, just a heavy hush that settled over the bunkhouse like a shroud. Tom Halstead was already up, kneeling beside the fire pit, coaxing the embers like a priest tending coals at an altar. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The fire told them everything they needed to know. It had burned low overnight, too low. The logs were nearly gone. What remained were splinters and ash. "You feel that?" Halstead said, voice low. "Air's heavier, like it's got teeth." He was right. The cold had sunk into the bones of the building. The wood floor had frosted in places. Tin mugs left near the wall had frozen solid. Even the breath from their mouths hung low and refused to rise. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was stillness, deep and unrelenting. The kind of cold that made men forget what warmth used to feel like. They had no choice. The younger one, Cale Morton, volunteered first. 19 winters behind him, most spent farther south, none like this. He grabbed the hatchet, slung his scarf across his mouth, and stepped out into the blue-white glare of the prairie morning. The snow was crusted thick as barn ice and packed to the door jamb. He had to shoulder his way out, boots crunching through the drifts like cracking bone. Behind the bunkhouse, the woodpile stood buried to the waist. Cale dropped to his knees, brushing away snow until he found the frozen edges of the stack. He reached for a split log, but the cold had welded them together like iron to anvil. He wedged the hatchet between two and pried until one came free with a sound like a pistol shot. Back inside, the others flinched. "That'll draw wolves," someone said. Halstead shook his head. "Wolves don't move in weather like this. They wait for something to die first." Cale returned 10 minutes later, arms full of eight, timber, hands trembling from the cold. They clapped him on the back, wrapped his fingers in wool, held them near the pit without touching. No words. Just thanks passed through firelight and steam. That day, they made a pact. 2 men at a time would haul wood every morning, no matter what. They would not let the stack run out. Each log was life, measured not in hours but heartbeats. By nightfall, the wind returned. It moaned across the flatland like a morning call, snaking under the door, teasing at the edges of their coats. They stacked the new wood tight beside the pit. Then they stoked the fire high, let it roar for 1 hour, just one, as a defiance. And in that hour, when the walls creaked and the night pressed close, they remembered the sound of splitting wood, sharp, human, stubborn. It meant they were still alive. By the 8th day, the bunkhouse felt like the last warm place on the prairie. Out beyond the line camp, the land had turned into a graveyard of white hills and black fences. The cattle were still out there, scattered across the range, huddled in draws and windbreaks, too many to gather, too stubborn to corral. And now, too far gone to save. One by one, they were dying where they stood. Tom Halstead had seen it before, back in the Nebraska blizzard of '78. He remembered riding fence line and spotting steers frozen in place, tails down, eyes milky, legs locked stiff. They looked like statues left out in a storm. He said nothing of it now, but every time he looked toward the hills, his jaw set tight. The bunkhouse crew took shifts riding out, checking for strays that might have huddled close enough to survive. They found few. One day, a pair of yearlings wedged in the lee of an old cottonwood. Another, a heifer near the creek bank. Too weak to stand. They had to put her down. Her legs had frozen through. The worst was what they saw on the fourth ride out. 5 steers lying in a shallow gulch, piled like driftwood, bellies frozen to the ground. Something coyotes maybe had been at their eyes. The snow beneath them was stained pink. The color stuck in their minds long after they rode away. Back at the bunkhouse, they burned more wood. Not from need, but from the weight of what they'd seen. The fire wasn't just heat anymore. It was memory's shield, a place to put the images they couldn't scrape from the backs of their eyes. Cale Morton started sleeping closer to the fire pit. One hand stretched toward the warmth even in his dreams. Sometimes he muttered things, names, maybe, or prayers. No one asked. No one wanted to hear their own fears said out loud. Each night, before turning in, they checked the window, a square pane thick with frost, rimmed in gray. Through it, they could just make out the horizon if they scraped it clear with a coin or knife edge. One evening, the sky turned red. Not fire red, but blood red. A sunset drowned in smoke and ice. Tom stared at it a long time. Then he said, almost to himself, "It's gonna break something." That night, they reinforced the door with a crossbar made from a wagon axle. They stuffed rags in every seam of the floorboards. They brought the water bucket close to the fire, knowing it would freeze otherwise. Then they sat together, all 7, and listened to the wood pop and hiss. The wind outside had found its rhythm again, long, low, cruel. But inside, the fire burned bright and stubborn. Against the red snow and the cattle ghosts, it was the only light that did not flicker. The cold took its first man on the 10th night. They had done everything right, or close enough. Fire stacked high before sunset. Blankets doubled. Boots left near the pit to stay pliable. No one had gone out after dark. No one had drunk too deep. But the cold doesn't bargain, and it doesn't always come through the door. Sometimes it waits inside the breath, in the slow drift of sleep. His name was Corwin Lee, 52 years behind him, former cavalry, ex-deputy somewhere west of Dodge, and no stranger to pain. He was the one who sharpened blades with a whetstone so fine it sang. Who told stories about Apaches and whiskey and the railroad jobs he walked away from. Who could split a log with 2 swings and never raise his voice. They found him in the morning, still wrapped in his buffalo robe, knees pulled toward his chest like he'd folded in on himself. Eyes closed, mouth slightly open. Peaceful, they said. Quiet, like he'd just drifted. Cale Morton was the one who shook his shoulder. The youngest always does. And when Corwin didn't stir, didn't grunt, didn't even flinch from the cold, Cale whispered his name again, then louder. Tom Halstead came over. He knelt beside the body, placed 2 fingers behind the jaw, waited a long moment, then nodded, just once. The others didn't speak, didn't cry. Cowboys don't cry for the dead. But every man there felt something leave the room, something human, warm, and silent. They wrapped Corwin in canvas and laid him in the lean-to behind the bunkhouse. The ground was too hard to dig, the snow too deep to ride for help. He would wait there, still and sheltered, until the thaw came. Tom carved a small plank of pine, rough and narrow, and burned the name in with the tip of a hot nail. C. Lee Winter of '86. That night no one joked, no one cursed, no one mentioned the woodpile, though it was getting dangerously low. Instead, they all sat close to the fire pit, too close, their shadows merging on the floor like spilled ink. They passed a flask of rye, then a second. They listened to the fire, and in the silence between pops, they listened for each other's breathing. Corwin knew it was coming, said Halstead finally. He said 2 days ago it felt like '83 in Wyoming, said men dropped like fence posts back then. Cale nodded, still staring into the flames. He looked warm, Halstead replied. That's how it tricks you. Right before it takes you, It lets you feel warm again. The bunkhouse seemed smaller after that. The fire felt more desperate. Every log burned carried a name now. Every flicker meant something you could lose. And the wind, cruel as it was, never stopped trying to find its way back in. It was the 12th day when the knock came. No one moved at first. They thought maybe the wind had thrown something against the door again, a branch, or the tail end of a drift breaking loose from the roof. But then it came again. 3 knocks. Slow. Not urgent. Just patient. Halstead stood first. He crossed to the door, boots echoing on cold wood, hand resting on the crossbar. He didn't lift it right away. He turned and looked at the others, as if asking silently whether they'd all heard the same thing. They had. When he finally opened it, the wind tried to come in first. It burst through the seam like a curse, scattering ash and grit, and behind it stood a man barely. His face was rimmed with frost, beard iced over, eyes hollowed but alive. He leaned on a broken fence rail like a crutch, one boot half missing, the other stiff as antler. "Name's Jesse," he rasped. "Been walking since sunup. I saw the smoke." They pulled him in without a word. Jesse collapsed near the fire pit. They stripped his gloves off, or what was left of them, and unwrapped his scarf, which peeled away in frozen folds. His fingers were white at the tips. His cheek had a black patch. Frostbite, plain and mean. "Get him a cup," said Halstead. "And take his boots. Cut 'em off if you have to." Cale ran for the tin cup and filled it from the pot. Black coffee boiled so long it tasted like bark. Jesse drank it like a man crawling across sand. He didn't shiver, which was worse. The body forgets how to shiver when it's too far gone. They wrapped him in Corwin's old robe. It still held warmth in the seams. He didn't speak for an hour. Just sat near the fire pit, eyes tracking the flames like they were the only thing left in the world. Then, quiet. Camped with 2 others, north of the bluff. Drift came through. I made it out. Don't think they did. No one asked more. What mattered was he was here now, and alive. Sort of. Halstead looked toward the woodpile again. 6 men now, 1 more mouth, 1 more body to keep warm. They didn't say it, but the math lived in the fire. That night, Jesse slept beside the pit, his face turned toward the embers. His boots were gone, his hands bandaged with rags and lard. He'd likely lose 2 fingers, maybe 3. Outside, the storm returned. Snow slashed sideways across the plains like thrown sand. Somewhere in the dark, a beam cracked on the barn. Inside, the fire danced taller, wider, fed by hands that knew what cold could do now. They didn't talk of tomorrow. They talked only of the next log, the next hour, the next breath. And Jesse, even half dead, whispered before sleep, "This place feels like a second chance." By the 14th day, the fire had become law. Not ritual, not comfort, law. Every move revolved around it, how to feed it, how to stretch it, how to keep it alive like a heartbeat under the ribs of the bunkhouse. They no longer saw it as a pile of burning wood. It was something else now. A presence. A boundary between life and the cold, and it demanded attention. Jesse was the first to call it the rule. He said it without irony, half asleep, bandaged fingers outstretched toward the heat. "There's the rule of fire, boys," he murmured. "It gives, and you give back. But you break that rule, and the dark takes its due." No one laughed. Tom Halstead enforced it the only way a man like him could through quiet insistence and the kind of gaze that didn't need raising. They set a rotation. 2 men tended the fire at all times, no matter the hour. 1 to mind the flame, 1 to split wood if needed. Sleep came in broken, stretches. They ate standing sometimes, bowls of beans or jerky warmed over the pit, steam catching in their beards. The woodpile was a calendar now. They didn't mark days by the sun, they counted by what remained. On the 15th day, it hit halfway. They said nothing. Instead, Halstead led a cutting run. He took Cale and the 2 oldest hands, Emery and Bledsoe. They harnessed the mare, saddled her with rope and a drag sled, and rode out before first light toward a cottonwood grove 1/2 mile east. The snow was so deep it came over the tops of their boots. The cold had teeth again, harder than before. They found trees still standing, bark blistered but dry. Emery swung the axe. Bledsoe worked the saw. Halstead and Cale loaded. Nobody spoke. Their breath made halos around them. The only sound was the echo of steel and the occasional moan of the mare, anxious in the white hush. They filled the sled and turned back. The wind chased them the whole way. By dusk, they returned to the bunkhouse with enough to hold for 4 more days, maybe 5 if rationed. Inside, Jesse had stood watch. He'd fed the fire slow, sparing where he could, and earned a kind of respect for it. One of the men gave him a fresh strip of hide to pad his hands. Another offered him half a biscuit from his own pocket. The fire was still strong. That night, Halstead stood by it longer than usual, arms crossed, eyes on the flames. "Sooner or later," he said, "this freeze is going to lift. Has to." Cale looked up from where he sat, his face drawn. "And if it don't?" Halstead didn't answer right away. Then, just above a whisper, "Then we hold to the rule, until there's nothing left to feed it but the walls." The storm broke just after midnight, not in mercy, not in silence. It broke like a door-kicked open wind screaming across the plains, snow tearing sideways, and something heavy slamming against the north side of the bunkhouse with a sound that made every man jolt upright. Cale was the first to the window. He scraped the frost with the edge of his knife, squinting through the murky dark. "It's the barn," he said. "Roof's come off." Halstead was already pulling on his coat. "The tack's in there. Blankets, salt. If we lose it, we won't," Jesse said, already trying to stand. He was too weak. Halstead put a hand on his shoulder and nodded toward Emery and Bledsoe. "You two with me. Bring rope." The 3 men pushed out into the storm with their collars high and their eyes narrowed to slits. The wind hit them like a wall. The barn 20 yards away looked a mile distant in the whirling white. Inside, the bunkhouse trembled. Cale fed the fire, but his hands shook. Not from cold, but from imagining what it was like out there, the creak of lumber, the sting of snow, the roar of a storm that felt more animal than weather. They returned 15 minutes later, soaked through and raw-throated. They carried saddlebags and burlap sacks full of supplies what they could save. Emery had blood on his knuckles. Bledsoe's ear was black with windburn. Halstead's coat was slashed, the side of his face red from a whipping branch. "We tied the roof down best we could," Halstead said. "Don't know if it'll hold." No one asked if it was worth it. The supplies were spread on the floor beside the fire. Bridles, oats, salt, and 6 folded wool blankets stiff with cold. But something else had changed. When they'd gone out, the air inside had still held warmth, still felt like a place apart from the storm. Now the cold had pushed deeper. It clung to the walls. It crawled across the floor like spilled water. The fire wasn't losing, but it was no longer winning either. Halstead crouched near the pit and stoked it hard. He didn't speak, but his jaw was tight. Then Jesse, who hadn't moved in hours, said it. "We lost something." They all looked at him. "Not a man," he clarified. "Not yet. But something. That barn stood against storms for 20 winters. If it broke tonight, that means the weather's changing again." No one disagreed. That night, no one slept. They took turns on fire duty in shorter shifts, 20 minutes each. The rest lay with eyes open, watching the smoke curl toward the rafters, listening to the creaks and moans of a structure being tested by more than just cold. They held their blankets tighter, counted breaths. And outside, the wind kept screaming, not with rage, not with fury, with hunger. The stack was gone by morning. Not all of it, but close enough that it made the room go still when they looked. 7 logs remained, all cottonwood, no elm, no more rounds, no splits stacked in the lean-to, just those 7, resting like bones beside the fire pit. Cale sat nearest. He counted them with his eyes, then again with his breath. 7 logs, 7 men, One dead, one half dead, 5 still burning from within. Halstead stirred the coals, face grim. We ration now. 2 burns a day, morning and evening. Anything more, we'll be out by the next freeze. Jesse nodded from his bedroll. His fingers were wrapped in new cloth, thicker, cleaner. But he hadn't stood since the barn storm. "What about riding for more?" Bledsoe asked, though his voice lacked weight. Halstead shook his head. "Storm's not done. Snow crusted to the west fence. If you ride out, you'll freeze before you find kindling." "Then what?" Emery asked. Halstead looked to the roof. It was the first time he'd ever done that. No one followed his gaze. "We get creative." That afternoon, they tore apart the shelves on the west wall, the ones where old tack used to hang, mostly empty now. The boards were dry, some even curled at the edges. They broke them down, stacked them beside the fire like old promises. Next came the crates. 2 that once held supplies from the fall run cracked, now half empty, no more nails to spare. They fed those into the pit by dusk. The fire hissed, then sighed. Outside, the snow softened. Not in mercy, in weight. It sagged from the roof in thick crusts and rolled from the eaves in wet clumps. The sky had turned the color of gunmetal, but the wind had eased. It was the silence that scared them. "I've seen this before," Jesse murmured. "Storm pulls back just enough so you think it's done, then it returns worse. The dead kind of quiet." Halstead nodded once. "We prep for one more night. After that, we'll see." That night, Cale took the last shift at the fire, just before dawn. The time when cold bites deepest, when the line between sleep and death grows thin. He sat alone, watching the flame lick the last of the shelf wood. Only 5 logs remained. He thought of Corwin. Of the day they found him, curled like a story with no end. Of how peaceful he had looked. Cale didn't feel peaceful now. He felt carved. He stood slowly, took the dull axe, and moved to the corner bunk. The frame was made of ashwood, old but solid. He whispered, "Sorry, boys." Then he began to cut. Each swing echoed. The others woke, one by one, not with alarm, but with understanding. They said nothing, just watched as the youngest among them sacrificed his own rest to keep the flame breathing. By the time the sun cracked over the plains, the bunk frame burned hot. And their fire lived. It happened on the 21st day, quiet, sudden, almost too simple. The thaw came with no ceremony, no birdsong, no melting hymn from the hills. Just a slow drip from the roof, soft as breath, and a kind of weight lifting from the world. Cale heard it first. He was mending a blanket near the fire when he caught the rhythm. At first he thought it was Jesse coughing again. Then he listened closer, drip, pause, drip, and stood without speaking. He stepped to the door, unbarred it, and opened to a pale gray morning. The sky had changed, not much, but enough. The white above had turned the color of old pearl instead of iron. The air still bit, but without teeth. And the snow had begun to sweat. Patches of earth peeked through by the fence post. Steam rose faintly from the side of the barn, where the sunlight touched it. A crow called from somewhere out near the creek. That sound alone nearly broke him. He turned to Halstead, who was still seated by the fire, rubbing a sliver of pine between his fingers. "It's breaking," Cale said, voice hushed. Halstead didn't rise, just let out a long breath and nodded. "Ain't done yet, but it's starting." That day, they opened the door wide and let the light in. For the first time in 3 weeks, they didn't guard the heat like a secret. The bunkhouse filled with a kind of golden hush, not warmth exactly, but promise. Jesse stood for the first time since his arrival. His hands, wrapped and raw, trembled against the bunk post, but he stayed upright. The men laughed softly. When he did, not loud, not bold. Just that small kind of laughter men make when they realize they might live through something they thought they wouldn't. They took inventory. 3 logs left. 1 bunk frame sacrificed. 1 man buried in the lean-to, his grave still too hard to take a shovel to. And the fire still alive, burning low, steady. The rule had been kept. By dusk, the sky broke fully. A ribbon of blue carved itself across the west, and the wind turned south. They stood outside and watched it, faces bare, coats unbuttoned for the first time since the year had changed. "You think we'll remember this, right?" Cale asked, voice soft. Halstead didn't answer for a long while. Then, finally, some will, others'll twist it, say it wasn't as cold, that we didn't lose much, that it was just a winter like any other. Cale stared at the fire inside, at the scars on Jesse's hands, at the empty bunk. "But we'll know." Halstead nodded. "I will know." That night, no one fed the fire more than they had to. It wasn't about fear anymore. It was respect. Before sleep, Jesse leaned toward the flame, hands close but careful. He whispered, not to anyone, but maybe to the pit itself, "You kept us." And in that last hour before dreams, when the walls no longer groaned and the cold had begun to loosen its grip, the fire glowed steady, not fierce, not desperate, just enough.